Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. And I am really thrilled to be here with Emma Green, who is going to be talking about America Divided. And she's a journalist for the New Yorker and just has a ton of experience and might be able to really put a light on some of the things that we question. And so we're going to be, I'll have questions, but we'll also be going back and forth with your questions. So just a couple things before we get started. One is that I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And also I'd like to thank Emma for allowing us to partner with other libraries in Massachusetts. 29 stepped forward to say they wanted to be part of this. So that was thrilling, of course, because I think when libraries get together, we just make magic. And obviously this was going to be one of those magical events. Because we do have quite a few people attending this program, I am going to ask that you put your questions in the Q&A. It'll be much easier for me to keep a track of them and much more likely that your question will get answered. I am going to say that we are going to have a measured and respectful conversation about why America is divided. And I feel like Emma, after just talking to her for 10 minutes, is going to be a perfect conversationalist around that, not only my questions, but yours. So Emma, welcome. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really am delighted to be with all of you this evening.
Well, I know that you had to make time, away from life and kids and stuff. So I really, appreciate that. So as I said, you write for the New Yorker right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker, and before I joined the New Yorker about a year ago, I was a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine for quite a number of years. At the New Yorker, I cover higher education. At the Atlantic, I covered religion, but in my mind, the two beats are not so different. I have always imagined my beat as being about the conversations, debates, struggles over identity and boundaries that communities have among themselves. Those are always way more interesting stories in my mind than people fighting with their ideological enemies or people who are nothing like them. The debates and conversations that we have with those that we love and are in community with, our best friends, our community members, our family, those are the things that I think really speak to tough issues of the heart and of belief. So in the religion beat world, that was the kind of story I wrote about all the time within denominations and churches and synagogues and mosques. And in the world of higher education, it's not so different. The university is a wonderful petri dish of these kinds of debates and arguments. And so I see my job as trying to feel my way along some of those dividing lines within communities, again, among people who feel a sense of commitment to one another and a sense of shared belief or shared identity or shared project, but who nonetheless are trying to figure out how to make their way through something that is complicated or controversial.
Mm-hmm. And certainly right now, again, with this whole issue of divide, things are really complicated and complex. So we're not going to get to every issue that relates to it, but I certainly would like to start with your own experience in journalism. So you said this interesting thing in a video I saw of you accepting a journalistic award about how people make assumptions about you that then lead them to make assumptions about your writing. What does that mean?
I think any journalist, especially journalists who work for national media, has to contend with a sense of mistrust or assumption about what the media as a whole is out to do and biases that may be present in the media. Especially for my work, I often go and talk to people who are suspicious of journalists, for whom journalists aren't necessarily people that they talk to often or know in their own communities, so they don't have a sense of knowledge or trust that's instinctual, and who may have good reason to believe that a journalist would caricature their ways of living or their beliefs. So often when I am doing those kinds of stories, I am trying to understand what people are thinking about me and the kinds of assumptions that they have about me, and trying to figure out how I can meet them with very honest and straightforward statements about how I like to do my work. Some of those things that I try to share with people as I'm approaching them about doing a story, something that I'm interested in, is about trying to write worlds, describe worlds, paint worlds that feel familiar to them. I can never guarantee someone that they're going to like my story or agree with everything in it. But when I am describing a universe, the stakes of a debate, the kind of feeling of being inside of, say, a church community or a mosque community, I want people to read that and say, yeah, that's the world I inhabit. That's basically it. That's the world I live in, even if I don't agree with you. I care very deeply about trying to carefully and sensitively render different points of view and be fair to people, even if points of view would be considered controversial or unjust by others. And there are really difficult boundaries and lines that I have to figure out for myself with my editor, about when to also hold people accountable for points of view that they hold, or actions or policies that they pursue that might hurt others. I try to be really straightforward with my sources, with the people who I'm trying to write about as subjects, about how I think about these questions, because ultimately, I think that's the only tool I really have, is my writing and my word, to try to cut through some of those assumptions that they might have about what journalists do and the caricatures that journalists might make out of them in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And so do you, I'm just going to dig into this a little bit because there is so much distrust about media. And so in terms of actual reporting, do you then have, do your own beliefs and biases or whatever, do they affect the stories that you write or the stories you choose to write?
There's a big debate that's happening within the world of journalism that's arguably been happening forever, but I think has taken on new contours in the last few years, about your very question, which is the extent to which journalists can ever be free of bias, whether this notion of objectivity, which has long been an ideal in journalism that's talked about, is actually a naive way of pretending that certain points of view are objective or neutral, when in fact they're informed by all sorts of biases that journalists may or may not mean to impute into the writing, but nonetheless do. So in my view, I think the answer to your question inevitably is yes, and especially because I write for magazines. I'm not a newspaper reporter. I'm meant to be a little more voicey, making something of an argument, even if it's very subtle and implicit. I'm meant to be writing scenes. I do stories that are quite long and intricate and try to hold a lot of complexity in them. The nature of this work, and I think the nature of humanity, is that I am naturally going to bring in my background. I'm going to bring in worldview. I'm going to see questions a certain way. I'm going to be interested in certain things. But I think that's very different than trying to write a story so that the outcome reflects a personal opinion. I try very hard as a journalist to differentiate between cultivating my own opinions about things and finding stories where I can reflect those, or, rendering judgment onto subjects, and the act, which I think is actually much, much more useful, because who cares what I think in my own personal opinion, the act that's more useful, the thing that I can actually offer to readers, is trying to understand as deeply as I can, with as much complexity and breadth as I can, different points of view, especially on subjects that my readers may be unfamiliar with. They may have never met someone who holds a particular view, say about abortion, from in one direction or the other direction, trying to expose people to those arguments in the best faith possible version, with as much complexity and nuance as possible. Being able to color in those different points of view fully, that I think is the most useful thing I can try to do. And yes, the questions I pursue and the way that I put together stories inevitably reflects my judgment, but ultimately that's what journalism is. It's an extended act of judgment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good answer. So there's a difference between what you're talking about and what I think what we see a lot online in terms of disinformation, where it's not just your biases or background and you're trying to make that judgment call, but it's truly taking facts and turning them. So what is your view about how that has happened and how it's affected this divide that's become such a huge gap and chasm?
I think a lot about what I describe as an epistemological pulling apart that's happening in our society. This is something that a lot of people other than me have thought and talked about as well. This idea that we as a country do not occupy a shared fact universe, when you could argue that in previous eras, we basically did. There are 3 major news networks and people trusted their local paper, they trusted their regional or national paper. There were sources of information that people could turn to that they relied upon to establish the record, what had actually happened in reality. And I think for a lot of complex reasons, one having to do with the fracturing and decentralization of media and the falling apart of traditional media, but others having to do with the internet and a sense of widespread mistrust of traditional forms of information and expertise, especially on the right, but also in some pockets on the left. A lot of different factors have come together to create this sense of pulling apart where we are no longer able to sit together and share facts. So for someone who's in my line of work, that presents a dilemma because on the one hand, in order to get out of bed every morning, I have to believe that there is some sort of value to what I do. There's a point to my days. And I do believe that the basic, most fundamental, useful task of journalists is to put factual information on the record, to create a record of factual events to the best of our ability, and use that to inform people, to help people make decisions about how they want their community to work, to make decisions about what they believe, to make decisions about how they think about others, right? Hopefully to maybe broaden their blinders a little bit about how they think about their neighbors. So, if I am occupying this ecosystem where the pulling apart of reality means that people like me are inevitably not going to reach a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to instinctively mistrust the things that I'm writing, I think that puts a big onus on me to not only be careful and fair, and to sort of think expansively about how I am writing about subjects and what subjects I'm pursuing, but also just to know that every mistake that I make could potentially add to the precarity of the situation, right? That it could add to this sense of mistrust, the sense that journalists are out to get us, they're undermining us, they are condescending. So it's a lot of pressure. And I want to try to do the best job I can to get things right so that I am not further contributing to this sense of mistrust and the undermining of a common set of facts, which most usefully, I think, are established by journalists in the best case scenario.
You said something interesting a minute ago about you don't write for a newspaper, you write for a magazine. So is that very different? Because when I did have a question about the when they did away with the truth in news or whatever that was, that news had to be truthful or factual or something like that. I can't remember what it was. I'm sure people here know what I'm talking about. So how did that affect the news, or did it, in the sense that like there's always been some sense of mistrust for news and the facts and things like that? Did that just explode it, or did that just give more opportunity for people to bend or turn or twist the truth in news?
Yeah,
Fairness doctrine.
Okay, I see. So the fairness doctrine is really complicated, and the right-wing ecosystem in particular that sprung up as a result of that, and the kinds of alternative medias that have sprung up in the last 20 or 30 years, even longer than that, 40 years. I mean, it's all very complicated, and that all contributes to this sense of pulling apart, right? The different places that people can go to get their news, when in fact that news may or may not be governed by the rules of the Guild of Journalism, where we have to follow certain codes of ethic about how we treat sources, and we have certain shared goals and values about trying to put factual information onto the record. So all of that is really, really complicated. I think on the topic of magazine journalism versus newspaper journalism, or even separately radio journalism, television journalism, I think magazines are really specific in that the goal is to take topics that are of public import, whether they're the thing that's in the news today or some giant topic like, the warming of the planet, which is something that happens slowly over time, but is nonetheless really important for all of our lives, and to try to bring context to it, to try to report it with characters and scenes, to trace those characters and scenes over time through a sort of narrative that allows people to understand the arc of a story. There are a lot of fabulous newspaper writers, but I think magazine journalism in particular puts a real emphasis on writing to story and writing narrative. And I think ultimately magazine journalism does have to make an argument, meaning if you spend 8,000 words with a character or with a set of events, the magazine journalist is ultimately, again, not responsible for being the judge and saying this person was right or this person is wrong, but for giving the reader a sort of lens through which they can try to understand the story. They stack the story up in a way that helps readers to make sense of something that's really, really complicated. So, I brought up that difference because I think on the one hand, magazine journalists do fabulous reporting all the time that can be traditional journalism at its finest, putting facts on the record that are important for people's ability to advocate them for themselves in a democracy, which is, I think, one of the ideals of journalism. But there's also other layers to that I have to be really cognizant of. As I'm writing my stories, I want to make sure that I am giving that sense of narrative arc and that sense of story, but I'm not doing so in a way that renders judgment or is arrogant in assuming that I know how to think about the world or how one person's behaviors or actions are right or wrong. I'm trying to illuminate and color in through my work as a magazine journalist rather than to be someone who passes dictates.
And as a librarian, I'm really interested in that because you're telling a story. You said the arc, whereas news is something that I think of as very different from that. They tell a story, but they have to adhere to certain rules. That storytelling is a little bit different. Oh, I'm totally confusing this, but I had a point. We are not taking live questions. I do see a hand up, but feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm actually going to that right now. Scott says, thank you for your intriguing article about the professor at Whitworth University. I thought you caught the nuance of the culture of that place. Some friends at that institution thought it would be a hit piece, and it certainly wasn't. How do you draw people to open up to you given this hostility?
Thanks for the question. And for the benefit of those who might not have read the story, please do go back and read it after this. So I wrote a story over the summer about Whitworth University, which is in Washington State. And it was specifically about a professor who was there for a number of years and had actually started her career there and returned. And Whitworth is a Christian institution. It's a small Christian liberal arts school. And the professor there, Kathy Lee, was both a Christian and someone who identifies as gay. And she was closeted for many, many years throughout her career, essentially, until around 2016, 2017, she started to take very small steps gradually to come out on her campus. And the story is about her and her experience and why she decided to do that, what it was like to be closeted at Christian institutions, and why she felt that she needed to come out. And in telling her story, she was someone who I corresponded with for quite a long time before I published the story. I wanted to not only show her life and some of the challenges and struggles that she faced, but I also wanted to paint a picture of a world that is itself struggling with some of these issues. Christian institutions, and specifically evangelical institutions, really span a large spectrum in terms of how they deal with issues of human sexuality and gender identity, not only in terms of their policies, but also in terms of their tone, how they choose to approach it or not approach it, talk about it or not talk about it. And I wanted to capture this institution, Whitworth, that in some ways it doesn't get that much play in these conversations, this kind of institution, because it's a school that's caught in the middle. It's caught in the middle of a lot of cross-conflicting impulses, doctrinally, culturally, temperamentally. And the result of that cross-current of being sort of stuck in the middle is that Whitworth hadn't said or done much about LGBTQ issues. It was something that it stayed away from to a certain extent. They talk a lot at Whitworth about trying to walk on a narrow ridge. And I described in my article this feeling of the narrow ridge metaphor really being right, because on either side of a narrow ridge are steep drop-offs where if you fall to one side or the other, you die, right? You get really injured. And so, I tried to capture that sense of complexity and the sense within the institution itself that they were walking in this precarious way and they weren't quite sure how to maintain that sense of balance. All of that is to say, this kind of story is the kind of story that I love writing about most, because I love stories about people and places in gray, people who feel caught between, about whom the reader might feel ambiguous at the end of the story, people who you can see multiple perspectives through their story. Because ultimately, I think a lot of life is like that. A lot of life is gray. So I loved writing that story, and I'm really grateful to the question asker for having read it.
Yeah. Christopher asks, how can we get back to a common set of facts, or is that a lost cause in the age of cable and social media bubbles? Even those identified specifically as fact checkers are viewed with suspicion if they don't conform to preconceived notions.
This is a topic that I think about all the time. This gets back to those different reality bubbles that we were talking about before, the pulling apart of our epistemological universe. And the answer to your question is, I don't know if it is possible to get back to a shared fact universe. If I did know the answer and I knew how to get there, I would be a capajillionaire or maybe president of the United States. I don't know, something much more fancy than I am now, which is just a humble journalist. It's a complicated topic of whether we can put back together all of the things that are broken, especially because I do think this story of how we got to this place of an epistemological pulling apart is not a one cause linear story where you can see from beginning to end why it happened. There's a lot of stuff that conspired to create the ecosystem of information that we're in now, including, for example, the creation of the internet, which is not something that you can just stuff back into a box. So I don't know the answer. And I often feel unsure or pessimistic that it is possible to recapture some of that trust or to make people feel that there's a common source of information that they can turn to. What I will say is that I think, and I have to think this because I have to get out of bed in the morning, as I mentioned before, but I think that there will always be a desire for information. I think people want to know what's happening. I think people want to understand what's going on in their community. I think people want to understand what their leaders are doing. I think people, maybe even though it might not seem like it in the age that we're living in, people want to understand their neighbors, right? Even though we may feel very, very divided and it's impossible to reach across lines of difference, I think a lot of people are actually just really curious to try to understand what's going on in the head of people that they either don't share a religion with, or don't share a cultural background with, or don't share a set of political beliefs with. And so to me, that desire for information there will be something that meets that. And obviously, there are many sources of information that have risen up to meet that desire that are nefarious, that are full of lies and misinformation, propagandistic, whatever it is that you'd like to say. But I do think that journalism, which again, in its best form, is trying to put facts on the record to empower people in a democracy. I think that I have to think that journalism can serve some of that need. And my hope is that people trying to do a good job of that everyday work of putting facts on the record, ultimately, that is something that can stay true. It can be sustained even in this time of immense fracture and information chaos.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the 24-hour news networks have contributed to this divisiveness? Are they doing more opinion rather than straight news reporting to fill time and capture viewers?
Yes, probably. I think I'm allowed to say that because I am not a TV journalist, and I don't think I will ever be a TV journalist. I don't have nice enough hair to be a TV journalist. But I think inevitably the answer has to be yes, that certain form, especially this problem of needing to fill airtime. And I think, it's worth pausing to differentiate between local news and these national news networks. Even within the spectrum of national news networks, there are different personalities, right? NBC is different than MSNBC, and Fox is different than what, like, there's a sort of differentiation that I think is really important. And even within those networks, there are reporters, and then there are the hosts and the commentators. So it's not just one single answer. I think that would be unfair. But I think inevitably TV news is simplified. I think TV news often is more hair on fire and alarmist because it's trying to get people's attention. And I think that there's often crossover between television news and entertainment in a way that journalism always is crossed with entertainment to a certain extent. But I think the pressures in television around ratings are much more towards the entertainment end of the spectrum, trying to make sure that they're gripping people and bringing people in and making sure stuff is sexy. And those incentives are necessarily corrosive. I don't, again, just to be clear, want to trash all television journalists or paint with too broad of a brush, because there are a lot of people in TV news who do really, really good work and who are good reporters who break stories and are trying to do a really good job. But I do think that the form is particularly vulnerable to some of the corrosive aspects that the question asker was describing.
Mm-hmm. So Margaret asks, and this kind of brings us to where we wanted to be in terms of how can we get past this? How can we come back together? How can writers, journalists, and society at large have a meaningful conversation on such topics as global economics, sexual orientation, and global politics when there's no common ground, or it seems like there's no common ground? There just is so much anger and mistrust.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And also it's the job description. Especially for me, I am particularly someone whose job is often to pick up the most tender, sensitive, disagreed upon subjects in public life, and specifically in American public life, because I focus on America most of the time. It's the job description to try to go in and understand different points of view, to reach out to experts and historians and scholars to bring context, to myself be someone who is knowledgeable and informed so that I can ask good questions, to be able to identify the stakeholders, the subjects of the story who will give the most rich and full and nuanced possible take on whatever subject it is, whether it's global economics or politics or sexual orientation or whatever other subjects there might be on that list of impossible topics to cover, and try to fill in the picture as much as I can. And I have to know that I'm not going to be able to complete the job, because it's impossible with one story to complete the job, and it's impossible to fully fill out every perspective. But ultimately, I think there can be good that's done iteratively over time by doing that exercise over and over again, writing lots and lots and lots of stories where you try to frame the questions correctly, you try to bring the context that's appropriate, and understanding hopefully can be created. People can feel more informed, they can feel like their perspective is broadened, and those are some of the most important things that I can achieve. That like I would be so happy to have done that just in little meaningful ways. So it's the gig, and it's a tough gig sometimes, but it's the gig.
It's a good gig for some people, for a lot of people. I actually found you through your article about the Federalist Society, and I had a question about that because you took a very in a very emotional time and a very emotional topic, and you took a story that I was surprised by. So what you can talk about it a little bit more if you'd like to, but like what was the driving force for you to tell that perspective?
So the story that I wrote about the Federalist Society followed in part a young legal scholar at Notre Dame. His name is Sharif Girgis, who has worked on lots of contentious legal issues, including same-sex marriage and religious liberty, but he's also written a lot about abortion jurisprudence. He's someone who describes himself as pro-life. He's against abortion. He does not believe that the Constitution provides a basis for abortion rights federally in the United States. And he was thrilled to see Roe overturned. He had just seen Roe overturned about a month before we spoke. And I thought it was important to write about him, but more broadly, the movement that he's part of, the conservative legal movement, which is the legal movement of the Federalist Society, to try to show how this moment, that was a huge moment in our country, Roe versus Wade getting overturned, how it looked from the perspective of people who had been trying to bring about that outcome and had laid the intellectual architecture to bring about that outcome for literally decades. And moreover, I was interested in him particularly because he's young. He is part of a vanguard of scholars who haven't been in this fight since the 70s and 80s, but rather will be the people who take the next era. They will be the people who are having the arguments in this post-Roe, post-Dobbs era that we're in, trying to write the laws and figure out what basis there is to make what argument about abortion pills or about crossing state lines to have an abortion, whatever the topic might be. So to me, it's really important to speak to them directly, to understand how they're thinking about this moment, what they see as the big questions, what they hope for the future. And the conservative legal movement is something that I have written about over time quite a bit. This wasn't my first time covering the Federalist Society or some of the issues that they take up. And so it felt to me like it could be a useful contribution in that moment to bring clarity and some of that perspective to this really confused and chaotic moment. It was something that I thought that I was well positioned to do. So, it doesn't have to be the last word. And in fact, it's not going to be. I write about abortion issues all the time, legal issues related to abortion and other questions as well. And so I will come at this question from different angles. There are lots of different stories to be written. But in that moment, I thought that would be something useful. And I hope that it was for some readers.
Mm-hmm. And is that what you think is part of what needs to happen for people to start coming back together, is for people to hear each other's stories and to understand their perspective?
I think understanding, or at least attempts at understanding, can never hurt in this kind of country that we're living in, this pluralistic democracy. I like to think that hearing other people's stories can in some way create, even if it's not empathy, even if it's not understanding, certainly even if it's not agreement, a sense of being able to tolerate living with other people if you can know their perspective a little bit more deeply with more nuance, if you can understand their story and where they're coming from and what they've worked for. But one of the operating assumptions of my work as well is not that trying to read other people's stories leads to the sense of hand-holding and kumbaya, where we're all going to come together and be singing a song of unity. And suddenly, the lifelong pro-choice activists and the lifelong pro-life activists, they're going to come together and they're going to find a compromise, because I actually don't think that happens that often.
Right.
And I think one of the characters of America is, from its very beginnings, people with extremely intense belief commitments coming together and agreeing to geographically occupy territory next to people with alternative, opposing, extremely intense belief commitments. And the fact that our country is nonetheless able to hold together, that we can have elections and vote, that people can respect the process to a certain extent, although that is also under question. But to respect that process to a certain extent, and to respect the outcome of that process to a certain extent, that's the American story, right? And I think trying to increase our resilience to be able to tolerate other people who make us really angry, or who we really disagree with, or we don't understand at all their belief commitments about God or whatever it might be, but nonetheless, we feel resilient to respect the fact that they have a right to vote, they have a right to elect officials, and they have a right to live in society just like we do. That's a really important kind of resilience, I think. And so, all of that was very, very grandiose, right? That's my grandiose theory of the role of understanding stories in a pluralistic democracy, right? But I hope that I can contribute to that in a little teeny tiny way, right? One grain of sand on the beach. And if I can do that in that one teeny tiny way, then I feel good about the work that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Lachlan asks, or says, July 4th, 2026 is approaching the 250th anniversary of 1776. Underneath the divisive polarizations, are there some potentially unifying patriotic values or themes you have seen in your work that can foster and build from?
That's a great question. I haven't come up with 1776 250th anniversary themes yet, and I should. That's a great note to self that I will do that. My answer may feel like an inversion of your question, because it won't feel like a direct unity answer. But the phenomenon that I was just describing about this intense difference of religious communities or ideological communities, whatever it might be, cultural communities in the United States, nonetheless tolerating the fact that their neighbors have a right to vote and live in America just like they do. I talk about that a lot with sources and pose versions of that theory or question to them a lot. And people have very, very different views of that question unto itself. What's the right form of tolerance? Who should be tolerated? What the boundaries of our country and society should be? Certainly right now we're in a time when voting is quite contested. But I would say, especially from my days covering religion, I do think that many, many people fundamentally buy into that point of view, which is this sense of freedom to have beliefs that somebody else hates. I think one of the most complicated meta questions of the time that we're living in now is how people answer that question, which is, when other people hold points of view that we hate, that we think are bigoted or harm other people, what to do about that. And I don't know that we actually have a societal consensus on that, because I think we're in a moment of shifting norms potentially around how expansive the freedom to hold views that other people detest should be, and our ability to hold that sense of tolerance for others and that resilience towards difference with people, even really thick difference with people. But for now, I would say that when you get off Twitter and you stop listening to politicians, often I have discovered people have more of a digestive system for that than maybe stories have led us to believe. That in their gut, people kind of think, okay, well, I really don't agree with this person at all, but That's kind of the project that we're all a part of. So that wasn't necessarily a unity story. I'm not sure that anybody would cross-stitch that onto a 1776 anniversary pillow. So you might have to seek out another source for that, but that's the best I can offer in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, also there's a different, it seems like there's a wide perspective on what patriotism is right now too. So like Maureen says, we had an insurrection on January 6th, 2021. In her mind, that represents the biggest divide in our country. She personally feels that we're in a civil war, and she doesn't see how we can come together. And that comes into my thought about, like, if we have such a different perspective on what that means to be a patriot, can we come together?
I think it's a great question. And I have spent a lot of time, because I often report on the American right, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who question the narrative of what happened on January 6th, who don't actually believe that it was an insurrection. They don't actually believe that the people who stormed the Capitol were intending to do anything wrong. They were just kind of confused and wandering in. I wrote a story not too long after January 6th about the Christian imagery that was invoked during that insurrection, and the prayer meetings that happened actually in the month leading up to the January 6th insurrection around President Trump, but also just trying to save the nation. And a lot of the people who were involved in those gatherings were there on January 6th. And if they didn't enter the Capitol, at the very least, they were protesting the handover of power. And so, like the question asker, like you, Mina, I think it is a really fundamentally challenging question of what to do with the fact that a segment of the country, which I don't think is a majority, but is a segment, certainly a bigger segment among Republicans than it is among Democrats, of people who view a storming of the US Capitol, which many of the people who represent us in Congress believe was a legitimate threat to their life, that was protesting the peaceful transfer of power, which is fundamental to America working. How do we deal with the fact that some people don't acknowledge that as being a grave threat to democracy? And again, I think I don't have an answer, meaning I can't say to you whether that means that the country is doomed, or that we're in a civil war, or that our notions of patriotism are so fundamentally irreconcilable that it is impossible for us to hold together this experiment in democracy in America. But I do think that it's important to try to understand. So I do try to ask questions of people who do have questions about January 6th. I do try to ask questions of people who are skeptical of the narratives of the January 6th Commission and who question the January 6th report. I think it's important to talk to people about that and to ask them questions that are direct, that try to hold them accountable for their views, that pose the actual facts of the situation in a direct way, which is another important thing that journalists are able to do, right? Is to press principals and leaders on true facts. But ultimately, the service that I can provide is to illuminate what people think, even when it is something that may not comport with the facts as I understand them. And when that happens, I try my best to just write the facts as I understand them and present the viewpoints of those people while not allowing any truth to go, right? You can't let any truth to hold if it's not actually true.
Mm-hmm. Karen says, Einstein's theory of relativity is certainly at play here, because your truth depends on your vantage point, or your, what way are you looking at it? What's your perspective?
I think that's true to an extent. So there are certain questions on which people of good conscience can disagree, because they're fundamental questions of God, the universe, and everything, the nature of human life, whatever it might be, the nature of human persons. There are a lot of disagreements of that kind. I don't, though, think that all truths are created equal and all narratives of factual events are created equal. And one of the radical aspects of journalism in this era of the internet and an epistemological pulling apart and multiple information ecosystems, one of the radical things that journalism holds to be true is that there are true facts. Sometimes you cannot establish them because they are unknowable. Sometimes there are different points of view that you have to put in your story in order to be fair to all sides, but there are true facts. And it's really important not to give in to this notion that all truth is relative, or that, events can be just dictated by the points of view of the person that was there, or the person that wasn't there. So, Einstein is smart, I think, smart guy, but I'm not sure that he would be such a good journalist.
I would agree with that. He had his strengths. And Nicole says, do you think that our tendency to consume news and media that reinforces our pre-established beliefs and values is contributing to being fractured as citizens? Do you think that of our audience? Do you think of your audience when you write and the reach your stories will have?
So absolutely. I think people seeking out, especially partisan news outlets or news outlets that they know lean in the direction that they lean, leaves us in these isolated bubbles where we're not exposed to other points of view. We're not trying to understand the world through other people's eyes. We're not trying to sort of open that blinders that we all have of perception. And I think it also incentivizes news outlets to lean into that lean when they know that their audiences are aligned with a certain ideological outlook or have certain views on particularly sensitive issues. I think that can create this bad incentive structure for newsrooms to cater to that. And to your question, I am very much aware that the audiences that I rate for, particularly at the New Yorker, but also at the Atlantic, probably tend to be left or center left. I think it's just true that most people, like a majority of people, not all people who subscribe to national magazines or national newspapers, lean in a certain direction. But I would say two things about that. The first is that I was always surprised and delighted by the diversity of my readership at the Atlantic in particular, just because I was there for a longer time, so I understood my readership there better. A lot of people would write to me who I would be surprised by, who came from really intense or conservative or traditional religious communities, people who I didn't even think, would ever subscribe to the Atlantic or know the Atlantic, and they'd say that they love the Atlantic. And people who appreciated my willingness to be fair to people who otherwise aren't necessarily given a fair shake all the time in the national press. And I thought it was a really important thing to make sure that not only am I trying to be fair for its own sake, which I think is important, but also to be fair to everybody, because I know that those readers exist and I don't want to write them off ahead of time. The other thing that I will say is that I think even if I am clear-eyed about the kinds of people, again, a majority, but not everybody, who might be reading my stories at the New Yorker, I think it's still really important to be open and curious, to be expansively curious, to try to tell stories that will surprise or challenge my readers, and to pursue stories that are interesting as I see them. And that's the best privilege of my job, is that I get to go and learn stuff that I'm interested in, and write about stuff that I'm interested in. I mean, it's the greatest thing in the world that I get to go out and talk to people all the time and try to understand things that I don't understand. And so I think it's really important not to play to your audience, and try to feed them things that they already think or already know, because there's no point and it's not interesting. And it's much more fun to report a story if you don't know the answer when you start the reporting process than to report a story that you already know the finishing sentence when you've begun.
Mm-hmm. Roxy asks an interesting question about if you're planning to do any investigative stories about anti-Semitism or neo-Nazis. And I'm curious about this question because it seems like you do lean into things that could be uncomfortable for you or for your readers. And so that's why I'm, I'm interested in your answer to this particular question.
Yeah, so absolutely is the answer. It's not something that I've written about at the New Yorker so much, in part because, I haven't been at the New Yorker that long, but at the Atlantic, I covered anti-Semitism quite extensively as part of my religion beat, and spent a lot of time in particular covering the Tree of Life shooting that happened in Pittsburgh in 2018 and the aftermath of that shooting in that community. The Tree of Life shooting was the most deadly shooting in a synagogue in American history, and was just an astonishing event for the American Jewish community. And that particular community in the aftermath, I think, was really rocked by what it had come to stand for. It's pretty out of the way. Pittsburgh has this lovely Jewish community that's very rich and has a wonderful history, but it's not like, one of the main premier Jewish communities in America. And yet they'd come to stand in for this horrible thing that we see happening in our country, which is the bubbling up of, the unfolding of this ancient hatred that comes back in a recurrent way in every generation. And the person who is accused of having carried out those murders was someone who was a white supremacist, who did believe that immigrants coming to the border in a caravan were going to take over America, and who harbored these deeply hateful beliefs about Jews. So, I'm talking about this, describing all of this as context for some of my past work, and, just to underscore that I do think this is such a huge and important issue. And I think it's also important for this conversation that we've been happening, because it's an example of the water's edge of understanding, meaning I think it can be very important to understand the ideology and beliefs of people who hold bigoted viewpoints. And it's very important to draw a line and say, this is what extremism and misinformation and stew pots of propaganda and bigotry and racism and hatred and white supremacy, and specifically anti-Semitism, can do. They can produce real harm. They can produce the deaths of people. And to be very clear-eyed about that, and to not indulge that in any way. It's sort of that line around being open-minded and expansive. Sometimes there are things that you shouldn't be open-minded and expansive about. And I think it's really important, in particular with anti-Semitism, because it is something that is so much on the minds of American Jews and does seem to be on the rise in certain respects in America.
Mm-hmm. We just have a few more minutes, and I want to go back to a couple more questions. Joyce asks, what is more dangerous, misinformation or disinformation?
Let me try to define those terms as I understand them, because I do think they get tossed around.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think misinformation is people saying stuff that is incorrect, that isn't sourced in a way that is following the rules of journalism. It isn't fact-checked. It's sort of wrong information that's floating around. And I think disinformation, I associate that more with deliberate propaganda campaigns to try to misinform a public. Russian disinformation, for example, Russian trying to plant information on social media or whatever it is before an election, or just whatever things that might happen to try to actively mislead a public. I do think that the two can sometimes find themselves in an estuary where they're mixing together, and it's not so clear which is what and how to pull those apart. I think that it's really important to recognize the fact that we're living in this time of epistemological pulling apart, and the fact that there are so many ecosystems of weird and bad information floating around, and also bad actors trying to spread wrong information. And also, I think it's possible to get too fixated on those questions of misinformation and disinformation. They can come to color our framing of everything. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right framework for every question. Sometimes there are questions of fundamental premise difference. Sometimes there's a question of belief difference, sort of your commitments around what you think about, God or humans or whatever it might be. And it's okay to try to entertain those too. So, it's an important framework, but it's not the only framework.
Mm-hmm. So we're not going to get to everybody's questions, but I do want to get to Barbara's, who's been waiting for a while, because I think this is such a good one about what we wanted to talk about today. She was talking about in regards to the Whitworth piece, but like I said, we talked for a few minutes before we started, and I told you my entire life story. How do you get people to open up so you can tell their story?
Mina, I'm sure that you have a much longer life story that we
Oh, yes, yeah. I told you the main part, so.
This is a really important question because one of the privileges of my job and also one of the most tender responsibilities I have is to be a good steward of people's stories. And when people decide to open up to me and tell me about things, not just the facts and details of their biography, but really intimate things that they've been through. I've reported a number of stories where people have shared personal experiences that have been just awful and so challenging in many, many complicated ways. And it's a real privilege for people to trust me with that. And I don't know exactly how to describe in words what it is that I do to get people to open up, but what I would express is a hope, which hopefully I communicate to people, which is a hope that I show how precious it is to me that people are willing to hand some of their story to me and to be willing to have that story shared with others. It's a very vulnerable thing to be written about in a magazine, and particularly a big national magazine, where your story might travel in ways that you never, ever anticipated. And so I try to do that with care and dignity, and to afford people from a lot of different backgrounds with a lot of different viewpoints dignity. And I am hopeful that people understand when they are considering whether or not to talk to me, that that is my hope. I don't always do it perfectly because I'm human and I make mistakes, but I think it's a really, really important obligation of journalists to be good stewards of the stories of the people who trust them.
I do have to say, I think you're an amazing listener. You asked the questions and then you listened. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people have, is they ask questions and then they start formulating their next question or their next thought. I do. So one last question of mine is, what has been your favorite story to tell in terms of impact? We talked about, how we can bring people back together. What do you think, have you reported on or heard a story or anything like that you felt like was really impactful?
It's a great question. I will maybe sub out the word impact because I'm not sure that I can measure that in a way that feels satisfying. But I will just briefly tell a story to close up the conversation that has stuck with me for years and years and years, which I think speaks to the kind of story that I want to tell. It's a story I revisit a lot. I told it years ago, and it happened as an accident. I showed up to a Mennonite church outside of Washington, D.C. It's in Hyattsville, Maryland. And it was because I was interested in Mennonite churches and what was going on there, and just asked if I could come on a Sunday and talk to the pastor. And it just so happened that the church was at the very end of a 10-year process of being evaluated by the regional conference for whether or not they could stay in their conference, because they had allowed a gay person to be on their membership rolls and then later hired an assistant clergy who was gay. And they were just about to go to a conference with their regional body that would be where they would hear whether they were going to get kicked out of this denominational body that they'd been in for a long time. So I asked if I could go, drove in the car to rural central Pennsylvania, the meeting of the Allegheny Mennonite Conference. And we were in this old church with high ceilings, wood, and the people there brought potluck. They were people who had been coming together for these kinds of meetings for decades. And they sat together for an entire day and, using the rules of Robert's Rules of Order, went back and forth, pro and con, about whether they wanted to kick their friends out of their church body. And the thing that I found most stunning about this experience was, in between these speeches, which were very heartfelt and emotional, they would come together and sing. They had hymnals, and they're, low church tradition, low church Protestant tradition, and they would sing these beautiful 4-part harmonies. So in the middle of all this disagreement, they were reaching for and touching this deep, deep tradition, liturgical tradition, that glued them together. Ultimately, the church that I had followed got to stay by 1 or 2 votes. And immediately other churches rose and went to the mics and say, we resign from the Allegheny Mennonite Conference because we don't agree with this. We believe, this is a decision in error. And they left. And that day was a lesson that there was no possible way to avert the collision course of pain, of separation, and this feeling of fracture. But to me, that story is so much more rich and true than a lot of the stories that we hear, conflicts over LGBT issues or whatever it may be, because it speaks to the fact that there are stakes here. There are community members who love each other, who nonetheless can't come to agreement with one another. They share things, rich traditions and beliefs, and nonetheless, they might not be able to live together. And that's the kind of story that I try to tell, is people struggling with that question of, can we live together? And it's a hard one in America today.
Yeah, probably always has been, but it seems more so right now. But this has been really wonderful. I'm reading the comments and people are so interested and fascinated with what you've had to say, Emma. I really appreciate you taking the time to help us understand each other a little bit better tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Well, I appreciate everybody's time and attendance today, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I will send out a recap with the video link so you can watch it over again and share it with your friends, because I think it's really important that we have these conversations. So Emma, have a wonderful night. Thank you. I'll be in touch soon, and I just really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Mina.
Good night, everybody.